Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Janine Abrams McLean, president at FairCount in the United States and Tessa Democracy Fellow. And I want to bring you into a conversation that began earlier this year with two incredible fellows, Aria Carolina from Brazil and Tessa Dooms from South Africa. All three of us come from civil society spaces where we organize, advocate, and build community power. We found ourselves drawn into a shared reflection. We asked ourselves, what does it look like for women around the world, especially women of color, who have spent years leading in civil society, to begin to imagine a transition into public office? What challenges hold them back, and what opportunities open up when they step forward? Women in civil society are often the ones closest to the issues. But when these same women consider stepping into formal political leadership, they run into the same global patterns: limited access to funding, the burdens of caregiving, the emotional labor of leadership, and political spaces that still reflect old hierarchies of race, gender, and class. In Brazil, Aria talked about the barriers Black women face in even imagining running for office, and the profound power that representation carries. Her story makes it clear that leadership grounded in community is not only possible, it's necessary. From South Africa, Tessa shared insights about the limits of activism alone and how many women leaders are now realizing that shaping democracy from outside the system can only go so far. For some, the next step is stepping into political institutions, bringing their values, their experiences, and their communities with them. Women everywhere are asking what leadership looks like in a moment when democracies are strained, when inequality is widening, and when communities are looking for people who lead with integrity, care, and courage. So that's what we'll explore: how women around the world are navigating the transition from civil society leadership to public office, and what that might mean for the future of democracy when they do. So let's get into it with the incomparable Tessa Dooms, democracy, governance, and policy expert, author and radio host, director of programs at Rivonia Circle, and Kesef Democracy Fellow who champions political participation at community levels and across sectors. So, hi Tessa, it's so good to see you.
Hi, Janine.
So we started having this conversation about what it might look like for women who are leading in the civil society space to transition to political office way back in January at our retreat. We've had some time to think about things when you think about what's happening with democracy around the world, especially in light of what we've learned as KESAB fellows. How does this idea of civic leaders stepping into politics fit with and reimagining how democracy works?
2025 as a year has been one that's affirmed for me the idea that democracy needs a new lifeblood. And that new lifeblood is going to have to come in a number of different forms. We need to have the courage to imagine different kinds of institutional setups, perhaps even different kinds of institutions altogether. We're going to have to imagine different forms of participation. But essentially, at the heart of all of those things is different leadership, different ways that leaders show up. And the reason why, particularly in South Africa, that has been so clear in my mind that the leadership piece and a new way of democratic leadership has become so central is this has been a year where we have watched our GNU, our coalition government at national level, and various other coalition governments as well, show us that people are yearning, are so desperate for new and different kinds of leaders that they're willing to take on anyone who will come. And that has meant that even though we've seen new crops of leaders coming in to governance, we've seen really poor values, poor thinking, and we've seen a resurgence of old leaders coming back into the space in South Africa this year. There's this tension that's starting to brew between people who want the comfort of the status quo and are hankering towards days gone by, nostalgic about old leadership and wanting to bring those old leaders back. People who are desperate for new leaders and so desperate that they would take even compromised people with poor values, poor ethics, the place that leadership holds being this place of desperation. We, as people who've worked in social justice spaces, progressive politics, civil society, we've shown a commitment to the right kinds of ideas and values and spent a lot of time thinking about good ideas and good policies, advocating for them. But the truth is that people in power are not listening. There aren't very many incentives right now to make them listen. And we have to reckon with that. But more importantly, the time of civil society feeling comfortable that we have one democracy and therefore democracy will always win out in the end. And so if we just continue to plod along, eventually get there, that time is over. And if people are desperate, then surely there is a crop of leaders from social justice minded civil society that can fill up that void in a way that is at least less harmful than some of the options that we've seen coming up around the world. And so I'm very clear that that gap exists both for not just new leadership in terms of political leadership and people in government, but more importantly, people who have devoted so much time to thinking about what good policies and good ideas to make sure that they happen is going to take actually a sacrifice of our personhood, not just of our brain power.
Was there a point when you realized that working in civil society might not be enough to make the change that, you want to see or other people that you work with want to see that would necessitate a shift from leading in civil society to leading or seeking political office?
I'll give two examples. On a personal front, I at some point was appointed as a national planning commissioner. So I used to do a lot of work in the youth development and youth advocacy space. And what that meant was I got this inside look into government, but I wasn't a government employee. But I had this opportunity to be in rooms with ministers, with the president, with high-level decision makers, director generals, etc. And it was in that space that I realized just how easy it is for good ideas to enter the door of government and go nowhere. Mm. And that was in a room where there are a number of us who were part of the planning commission, were activist oriented, had worked on policy ideas. And one of the things that we were working on was universal basic income. And one of the people working on the team with us had been working on this and presenting it as a set of ideas to government for the last 20 years. Mm. This academic activist had been presenting these ideas ad nauseum for the last 20 years. And only when we got into the COVID space was anyone even willing to listen to the idea of universal basic income, because we got to the point of such a dramatic shift. And so I realized even at our best efforts, with great ideas, we're potentially throwing those ideas either at people who don't hear us, don't want to hear us, or don't know what to do with the things that we're saying to them. And that for me became really jarring in terms of my activist experience, because I started to ask myself, well, what is the point? What is the point of having a functional government and having all the activist space? We talk about shrinking civil space. South Africa hasn't had genuine shrinking civil space in the ways that other African countries have, even in the ways that some people in the global north are experiencing. Mm-hmm. Yet we've been throwing our best ideas at a system that is either unwilling to listen unless it's in crisis, or unable to do the things that we're telling them to do. And that was a big wake-up call for me, that more needs to be done than just thinking about what good activism we're going to throw into the room and into the space. I'll add another example of why it's important for us to organize society politically. That was also a realization in 2021 when we had riots that broke out in different parts of the country. And I watched the political leadership of the country not know how to respond at all, not have real connections to the grassroots, not have real connections to what's happening in communities in order to respond. And so again, that dearth of political action is because there's a dearth of political leadership. Most recently, an example of one of the things that's become a real concern. In a recent case, the city of Joburg started forcibly removing informal traders from the places that they were trading, confiscating their goods, etc. This group of organizations stepped in and provided legal support to these informal traders based off a court case judgment that was won already many years ago. 2013, they won a court judgment that not only prohibited the city from violating the rights of these people, but gave particular instructions about how to implement. And so not even court judgments compel leaders that aren't going to be interested in governing better to do so. And so I look at all of these people in civil society doing all of this work, and I'm like, I know that we say in a democracy the role of civil society is to hold government to account. But at some point, we need to recognize when those who govern and even the systems of governance aren't able to be persuaded. And then the mission changes to not trying to persuade the system to take our ideas, but thinking about how to change the system and who's in it. And I think those are the kinds of things that have driven me to the place where I think this is a really important conversation.
If there are people in civil society that are leading in these spaces that are frustrated, that feel like the next logical step is to move into seeking public office or considering it, how do you think people that are considering this can help rebuild trust if they are able to make that transition from civil society, leading a civil society organization, to leading in an elected position?
Maybe the first part is a recognition that we as people in organized, resourced civil society, in civil society that has access to power, we need to recognize that we are part of the trust deficit. We need to recognize that we are complicit in the system at this point. For the last 40 to 50 years, we have bought into the paradigm that this is what democracy is. We've helped co-create it. And what we have helped co-create is not working for the majority of people. For the longest time, civil society has benefited off a system we know and understand, even if we don't agree with it. And so the trust deficit that exists for people in government exists with us too. Yeah. A lot of people in civil society say, we don't want to go into government because nobody trusts government. It's for people who are playing a dirty game. The truth is that when people who are not in these spaces look at us, they see exactly the same people. We just happen to be wearing a different cap. And so it's not about building trust to run for office. It's about building trust to have any kind of sway, influence, or power in the society that people actually believe you're on their side. And the reason why it's easy for any number of people who have come into public life in the last 10 years and have been able to amass so many different groups of support on the narrative that the system is broken, have actually gotten support, whether their motives have been right, their messages have been good or not, is because fundamentally they've had the courage to say, I'm a person from the outside of the system and I'm willing to point out that the system is broken. And the reason why we haven't done it is because we are in the system and we have to reckon with that. And start the conversation with what responsibility do we take for where things have gotten to? What are we willing to level with people in society about in terms of what we have thought to be the right way and the right systems and the right processes that we are now willing to rethink and redo? Unless we're willing to do that, we're not going to build people's trust. In the work that we've been doing at the Rivonia Circle, the biggest thing for me that's come out of it, we run a program called the Democracy Builder, is we run facilitated conversations with people and we just ask them what their view is on democracy, governance, politics. And the biggest takeout in the entire conversation has been that people are surprised that when we walk into the room, they ask, what did you come here for? What did you come to try and do for us or do to us? And our response has been, We are here to ask you, what do you want to do? And how can we support you to do it? And I remember somebody said to me, from a political party, no less, said that he was most surprised that we had walked into a room and instead of telling them what to think, we let them speak before we spoke. That instead of coming with a set of ideas that we were trying to peddle, we gave room and space for their ideas and we were willing to be led by them. And I think that's how we build trust, whether we're in civil society or whether we're in government or whether we're in politics. We're going to have to build trust by listening to people and actually believing that even if we disagree with their ideas, that their ideas are worth listening to. And if we want to persuade people about our ideas, we need to be willing to be persuaded by theirs. And I think that bringing in a sense of what I'll call community and grassroots equality in democracy. People just want to be taken seriously and they don't believe that the structures and powers of democracy, whether in government or outside of government, see them and take them seriously.
So if this movement to blend leadership from activism and politics really takes off, what do you think democracy in South Africa and democracy around the world could look like in the next 10 years?
In 10 years' time, I hope democracy looks like is a politics and political systems that don't only ground politicians in the communities that they say that they serve, but really have a co-governance to them that is practical, right? We talk about it in feminist spaces, that the personal is political and everything is political. I think what our democracy really needs is at a community level for there to be space, resources, investment, time in communities actually being able to live that out and being able to shape the democratic projects that they have in real time, and having politicians, people in civil society, people in business, people in these formal structures take their lead from those communities and support communities in what they are doing, as opposed to co-opt communities into what politicians want, into what civil society wants, into what somebody else wants. And so a really grounded politics is not about going to the ground. It's about the ground being enabled and empowered and resourced to actually govern itself. And for you to be, as a politician, as a public representative, an enabler of people's self-governance. Mm-hmm. And I think these things are actually possible, not only in a social justice sense, not only when it comes to issues around rights, but also around the economy and economic participation. I think that one of the biggest problems that we've had is the Washington Consensus. The Washington Consensus has become, for me, one of the important historical moments we need to reflect on and undo its harm. Because of what happened in terms of the Cold War and the Soviet Union fall, and how in the 70s and 80s, there were these big dramatic democratic shifts happening both, in the global North and the global South. Africa had just gone through its liberation moment for the most part. South Africa lagged behind in that. But if you think about that period of the 70s and the 80s and the early 90s, of this democratic consolidation that was happening, what was also happening at the same time was a conservative economic pushback in terms of what kind of economy we want to have. And so we won a lot of battles when it came to democracy in terms of rights and political freedoms, but we also made a lot of concessions when it came to economic power being based on models that were exploitative and unequal. And I think that democracy has been infected by that moment, by those economic ideas. And people in the global North forget that in the post-World War II period, they had the Marshall Plan, they had the New Deal, they had all of this time to consolidate a social consensus economically to build shared economies before they got to the Washington Consensus turn. But for the global South, we got thrust into the Washington Consensus turn while we were still trying to get on board with just having democracy. And so for the most part, in the global South, our version of democracy is married to an economic system that is out of control of the hands of the majority, out of the control even of elites outside of the global North. Now, that may seem like it's very far removed from democracy and politics and governance. I don't think it is. I think that the democracy project that we need right now is one that democratizes everything, including the economy, and asks questions of what kind of economic systems and models in the last 40 to 50 years we have come to take for granted that has actually been robbing people of the opportunity to govern themselves when it comes to that aspect of their lives. We have to have a conversation about whether or not the kind of economics we've embraced are compatible with the kind of democratic values we say we embrace and the kind of democratic outcomes we say we want. I don't think they are, and people feel it. And that's why South Africa has a slogan that says economic freedom in our lifetime. And this idea that we can feel that we know that we've got political freedom, but if it doesn't come with real economic freedom, what's the point?
Yeah.
And people are feeling that disjuncture. And I think that's one of the things we're going to have to solve for. We need economic models that make the democratic promise a lot more real.
Beautifully said. We're going to just narrow it down a little bit more from general civil society. What are some of the biggest hurdles that you think women face just trying to enter the political space where you live or in general?
Unfortunately, the answers are predictable. The biggest thing that I've thought about in terms of women's participation in politics and the move from civil society is that even in the civil society space, women are very much seen as the hands and feet of democracy, but not the brain. So even in the civil society space, you will see women active everywhere. But when it comes to the negotiations, the strategies, the boardroom discussions, all of that, women have to prove their worth in every conversation. And particularly when it comes to conversations about resourcing, whether it's in civil society, whether it's in politics, women don't get money. It's one of those things that nobody's willing to talk about, how women need the guarantor of a man in the room in order for somebody to trust them. So even if they have the ideas, the capacity, the skills, often women won't be trusted. Their own ideas will be presented by a man and funded. When they were presented by them, they would be rejected. And so there's just this general lack of trust in women's leadership. And what people think it's about is the cultural norms in society, that society wouldn't allow itself to vote for a woman, be led by a woman, all of that. And the research tells us there's a reason for that. Because society is not presented with the opportunity to do so often enough to actually figure out if it's something that is possible. Now, in the South African context, there's one woman who defies that. And she happens to be a white woman, an old white woman now. And so she gets levels of privilege in a society like this in terms of trust, in terms of perceived competence, even in terms of perceived assertiveness and the ability to cope. And she is just assumed to have those things. But she had to be a particular kind of woman to even have the beginning of that conversation happen around her. And I don't care how smart, how accomplished, how experienced an old white woman is in this country. There's no way you can tell me that in terms of the ethos of politics and democracy being about representation, that a country of majority poor Black people would see in themselves the ability to be represented adequately by an old white woman. Not unless what has happened is that the system has backed up that particular woman and given them that particular option as their only option when it comes to women's leadership. And so we say that society is not ready.
That's not true.
We don't know society is not ready. We've not given society the option.
Yep.
And every time women try to raise their voices, to come into those spaces, they are criticized and questioned at so many levels that it becomes impossible for them to just ascend. And in fact, there's now, in the South African context, an interesting set of circumstances emerging around Black women's leadership in public life. But it's coming from conservative politics. So there are 2 or 3 women who are starting to gain prominence in conservative civil society, in a civil society that is very MAGA-esque in its orientation, if you would. And it's been interesting to watch this because nobody has asked questions about who's backing these women, who's backing this group. It's almost as they've been left alone for so long that they've had the opportunity to prove that they can build mass support, that they can build bases, that they can get funders. And nobody's asked questions of them because the majority of the country has just not thought that they would succeed anyway. And so they've had this kind of opportunity to grow their portfolio because they haven't had to live under the scrutiny of why do you think you can? And in progressive civil society, that's the first question everybody gets asked. Why do you think you can? Why do you think it's you? Why should we listen to you? And there's this scrutiny that comes that almost intrinsically undermines the efforts. And what this different politics that hasn't been paid attention to has taught me is that, in fact, women can be taken very seriously. Now, I don't agree with their politics, but the lesson is learned that if we actually just got out of women's way, we may actually see them succeed.
Thinking back to the 3 main countries, so Brazil, South Africa, and the United States that KESIP focuses on, what do you think women from these 3 countries can learn from each other about breaking barriers, especially when it comes to navigating a possible transition from civil society to politics?
I will say what I think South Africans can learn from the other 2 countries. I think South African women in particular, but civil society in general, can learn that it is not incongruent to pursue civic and political power. What I've seen in the US and Brazil are such great examples of people being unafraid to say we build civic power so that we can contest political power, whether it's contesting that political power for accountability or contesting that political power for positionality. It's not a competition between the 2. Therefore, the transition should not be hard. In the US and in Brazil, there's a lot more acknowledgement that the possibility exists for people to move from civic into the political. And I say that because in those 2 countries, there are even laws that help the distinction so that people can then legally move themselves around when they are going into the contested political space, etc., or when they're in civil society but want to do political work. The Brazil Lula moment is always raved about in progressive civil society in South Africa. But what people fail to take it to its logical conclusion with is that it took progressive civil society taking a political stance to organize for the Lula moment that made the Lula moment possible. The Lula moment didn't happen because civil society was neutral. It happened because civil society made political choices. Now we're seeing the same thing with the Mamdani moment. The Mamdani moment happened because people were willing from civil society, from social movements, from community groups to back somebody's politics and back it with their chests. So the idea of endorsing candidates and having groups being able to actually do that. We don't have that culture in civil society in South Africa. and we frown upon it. But it then stops us from being able to have conversations about how we actually engage and influence political power.
Yeah.
And I think that there's so much to be learned about that from both Brazil and the US. The second one for me is that there's also not only the potential, but the necessity of taking your people with you. That the transition isn't into a party where the party becomes your people and your civil society people are no longer your people. No. In the South African context, if you're going to go and contest for politics, even if you were a comrade today, you have now become our adversary. It makes no sense. And so if you want your person to not be compromised by political parties and the political systems that they go into, go with them. Those are the kinds of things I've seen in the US context. When I think about Stacey Abrams and the ways in which there was this ecosystem built around her that was willing to go with her into battle, to go and fight for that political space. I think we have a lot to learn about that. I think courage is definitely on the list of things for me. We always talk in South Africa about being afraid to die, that if you go into politics, you may die. I would just say to my civil society friends in South Africa, around the world, all of it, we're going to die anyway. If we're going to fight for what is right in a world that is wrong, and we are even remotely successful, it won't matter if we're in business, in civil society, in public service, they'll kill us anyway. And then the final thing I'll say is about leading local. And that's been an inspiration for me from both the Brazil experiences and the US experience. Meeting people who see such value in local leadership, in local government elections, and not just this idea that you have to go for the big fish and the national type. Just seen so many great examples of people seeing real value in local politics. And I think that that's a place that we could definitely start.
Heck yeah. Love that. I'm going to end with one last question. What is something right now about your work that is bringing you joy?
What's bringing me joy is watching a younger group of people find their political consciousness. I'm seeing it within the civil society space. I'm seeing it within the political party space, where young people who've been part of politics as usual are now starting to kind of have these moments where they're like, is something else possible, and starting to assert themselves. But even more interestingly, young people who've not been part of the system in any way, not been part of organized anything, really wanting a space to organize, to hear themselves, to see themselves. And it's incredibly heartening to see people who've never organized before have their first organizing victories or have their first organizing defeats. I'm involved in a project called the National Dialogue, and it has brought together the most unusual group of humans from civil society, kind of big C, and grassroots community-based civil society as well. Seeing these people think of themselves as organizing at a national scale for the first time, really feeling seen, feeling heard, feeling like they could be part of something bigger than themselves, has given me tremendous joy. And watching young organizers who have been scratching at this for a while take on bigger and bigger organizing roles, and sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding. It's just building this muscle that I think is really important amongst the younger generation of people. And I don't agree with all of them, but I'm also of the view that if we wait for all the perfect conditions to agree with everyone, we'll lose more people than we gain by waiting for everybody to have all the right words and the right phrases and the right way of speaking and the right way of thinking. In fact, all of that might be the wrong ways, and we may have things to learn.